Education, psychology, and the brain. The ability to see things has always has a dramatic impact in science. The microscope, for example, allowed people to see things too small to be observed by the senses. At the beginning of the 20th century, Santiago Ramon y Cajal was able to observe individual nerve cells under magnification, and during the century's last 2 decades, neuroimaging technology allowed scientists to observe the human brain in operation. For the first time, it was possible to view the areas of the brain that acting during thinking. A second major 20th century development stemmed from the epic discovery of the role of DNA and as the basis for the gene. By centuries, and we had a complete map of the human genome. Although aspects of neuroimaging technologies had been developing over a long period, only in the late 1980s did it become clear that a new era of direct observation of human brain actively had arrived. The ability to see into the human brain depends on the operation of the nerve cells originally observed by Cajal. When neurons are active, they change their own local blood supply. When neurons are active, they change their own local blood supply, which make it possible to trace areas of the brain that are active during cognitive process by measuring local change in the brain's blood supply. It is now possible to look inside the human brain as it thinks. Dramatic pictures can be taken of brain actively tasks such as those involved in the practicing the retrieval of word associations shown in figure 1. Within a few minutes of practice, the brain networks involved change radically. Seeing the brain in action provides information on how brain networks adapt to learning. Figure 1.2 shows the results of a number of such studies and illustrates that particular brain areas can become active in studies of reading and the perception. These results provides a whole new perspective on how the brain responds to common events and tasks. Over a decade has now passed following the discovery of a method for the active imaging of the mind. During this period, much has been learned about the anatomical areas that underlie many human skills, including aspects of language, face perceptions of the. Their studies have been generally involved adults, but researchers have also sought to understand skills important to the learnings of infants and children. In this volume, we address the significance of these observations. For parents and teachers, these few findings will allow for a degree of understanding of human development not available to any other generations. To take best advantage of this new knowledge, educators and parents will need to understand the strengths of limitations of these methods, and researchers will need to understand how to use these methods to identify new lines of inquiry. Attention has been one of the most important areas for imaging studies. It has been possible to image brain networks related to orienting to a sensory information, obtaining the alert state, the meditating conflict between possible behavior. Because attentional networks are central to the ability of infants and the children to regulate their emotions and behavior, they are at the heart of our home, of our volume. As mentioned earlier, the second major development during the late 20th century was the mapping of the human genome. It is now possible to understand that some of the variation in the efficiency of neural networks might be due to the form of genes and the child inherited. Genes lay down the basic organization of the brain and the time course for the birth of the deaths of neurons and influence how people differ. Together with expertise, they play a substantial role in determining the organization of neural networks important to attention and memory. Although the genes involved in coding structures underlying brain activity and similar for all humans, differences in gene structure are also found. These differences, called polymorphism, can help account for individual differences in temperament and attention, and relate to how different children will react to a given learning environment. Learning and education. Parents have taught their children by word of example. since human life appeared. In addition, the profession of teaching and research have been gradually added more formal guidance to children's instruction. Educators and researchers have traditionally been concerned about what can be taught and why, without understanding how experience influences the brain systems of children. However, there has been a wide range of speculation about education and the brain. Current views range from the belief that education can serve only to select mechanisms that have been already built into the brain, to the belief that there is no limit to the skills any person can acquire with practice. In his book Nature Mind, Michael Gazia put forward a selectionist view of the development of the mind. In this view, education is mostly about finding specific skills, the capacity for which is built into the brain. This view holds that genetic determination of what can be learned is so complete that it is foolish to attempt development of skills for which a person is not inclined. Taking a very different view, the late Herbert Simon argued that we can all become expert given time and effort. An expert in Simon's view is anyone who spent 50,000 hours acquiring at high level skill. Simon knew that the brain was involved in such learning, but he did not regard it as limiting what can be achieved in any important way. When two brilliant scholars of mental function hold such opposing views about what education can achieve, it is clear that if a further look is needed to reach some kind of consensus about the brain and education. Controversies about education are by no means new, and the psychology has often played a central role in them. The psychologist Edward Thorndike developed an approach based on association of ideas. According to Thorndike, associations between an external stimulus and response, the student's correct answer, are the central goals of learning. Specific associations differ from one domain to study to another, and the likelihood that one idea would active another dependent on their similarity. Thorndike argued that any transfer from one field of study to another needed to be based on common elements between the things to be learned. According to his analysis, identical elements between English and Latin or Greek, rather than any general increase in capacity from having learned the classical grammars, made for goods transfer. Association. Thorndike's associationist view of learning was carried further by the students of behaviorism in the early to the mid 20th century. Research conducted at the beginning of the century by the Russian physicist I. P. Pavlov provided a physical basis for association. Pavlov showed that pairing a new stimulus with a stimulus that elicited a reflex led to a new stimulus to produce the reflex response. In the classic example, a bell paired with food power and come to exit salivation. Thus, experience could lead to the acquisition of new associations. This experiment, termed classical condition, provided a physical basis for the association of ideas. B. F. Skinner generalized the reflex ideas of Pavlov, proposing that the association between the response and the subsequent reward could also be strengthened. The effects of repeated pairings of response and reward would increase the probability that the reward response would occur. Skinner argued that experience worked in much the same way as did evolution. Experience selected the responses that led to an reward, just as evolution selected by the genes underlying response that led to survival. In the educational situation, students make the responses and rewards most often come from the teacher. Skinner's educational goal was to analyze the mastery of any subject, breaking it down into component steps that would allow to students to easily perform a correct response, receive a positive reward, and thereby have the association increased in strength. As each new correct answer was given in the presence of the appropriate question, it formed the It formed the basis for still higher level questions, leading inevitably to mastery of the subject. The teaching machines and programmed learning that followed from Skinner's analysis assumed that the student can learn best if an environment is created in which no errors occur. Continuous positive reinforcement would gradually shape the response. In one sense, Skinner's view was very optimistic. He like Simon, felt there were a few limitations on what any human might learn. In Skinner's view, the capacity for learning was present in each individual. It was up to the teacher to provide the structure and rewards that fostered learning of the specific associations needed to master a field. The principle of association of ideas was further developed and related to the brain. The idea was that one thought led to another based on the similarity of the two or their having been previously active at the same time. The idea of association was also transferred to a model of brain function by the Canadian neuropsychologist D.O. Hub, who later laid down mechanism by which experience would allow nerve cells to be organized into new assemblies. He argued that when neurons were active at nearly the same time, the physical changes occurred that increased their ability to active each other. The acquisition of a skill required neurons to improve in their ability to communicate by increasing the likelihood that one cell would active the others. As a skill develops, the assembly of neurons begins to act as a unit of cell assembly. Cognition. For nearly 14 years in the mid 20th century, the idea of J. Piaget dominated psychological thinking about how the mind develops. Piaget produced a detailed and sophisticated retreatment describing how the initial genetic endowment of human infants matures in a series of stages into the formal operations of the thinking adult. Piaget places relatively little emphasis on the ability of education to alter and speed these changes, and his views were used to support the idea that subjects should be introduced only when the child stages of mental development was ready. Jerome Bernard took a different view. He argued based on a cognitive perspective that when properly analyzed, any subject can be introduced in some legitimate form to students at any age. Bernard, like Piaget, marveled at the intellectual accomplishment of the infant. Bernard was not arguing that there were critical periods of learning, that is, times when a certain kinds of learning must occur or it never will.